Digital Media presents The Butterfly Dragon, What Different Eyes See, Vietnam's Special Edition by Brian Joseph Johns. Delegation Discussion. The flight of the Canadian SY-349 delegation was silent, floating upon the wings of a great metal passenger bird who'd already flown this same voyage many times. Within that bird, a group of familiar friends were seated near each other, spread throughout the 3 columns of seating that ran the length of the business class cabin. There was Dr. Alicia Weston, the quantum biologist and genetic designer who'd created the SY-349. There was her friend and peer, Bryce Maxwell, a quantum physicist himself and jazz pianist to boot. There was mathematician Zhangni Wang, a self-described computational biologist. Beside her, Dr. Stephen Briggs, a sociologist with a degree in psychology who specialized in Asian culture. There were Doctors Katya and Victor Piotr, specialists in biology and specifically with the bizarre pseudo-organisms known as bacteriophages. There was fashion designer and now diplomat Haylin Yates, also known in her native Chinese as Ai Yuan Lin Ying, and beside her there was fashion model and good friend Monique DeFleur. Across from them was corporate analyst Valerie Aspin, who'd handled all of the logistics involved with arranging the travels and accommodations of their delegation through Asia and Southeast Asia, though for this leg of their voyage, they were now on their way to Ho Chi Minh City from Beijing. They were all close enough in the cabin to one another and were currently in a heated discussion. Picture this. It's 1969. You're a 19-year-old American trainee who's just passed their basic course only 2 weeks previous. You've been drafted by your country to fight in a war. Ironic how the time of life that you first discovered peace, love, partying, and cannabis was also the same time that you were trained how to use a rifle. An M16, the first mass-produced rifle with plastic parts. Their training? Not to kill, as the press movement against the war may have publicized, but to avert the need for killing by the expression of overwhelming force, as the military doctrine indicated. Sounds noble, right? The problem remains that those backing North Vietnam also had the same idea. With the USSR supplied weapons and force via their Kalashnikovs, or AK-47s, the enemy would certainly cede without violence, right? Dr. Briggs explained the dynamics of warfare during the Vietnam era for the uninitiated on the flight. "I thought soldiers were trained to kill," responded Monique, in a questioning tone. "No, despite what most people may think, soldiers aren't taught to kill, they're taught to overcome. Everything a soldier does is based upon an objective, so you could say that a soldier is a specialist at completing objectives amongst a team of others similarly trained," Dr. Briggs expressed. "But what are their weapons for, then?" asked Monique, still curious about the topic. "Their training doctrine focuses on the fact that rifles are used not with the express purpose to kill the enemy, but to incapacitate in such a way that it requires more resources to deal with the casualty of a war injury than it would to deal with a dead body, the horrific economics of war. As cold as it might sound, if they simply were killers, they'd rarely achieve their objectives." Dr. Briggs answered Monique as best as he could. "So you're telling me they aren't shooting to kill?" asked Monique, sincerely interested in the answer, for one of her relatives on her father's side was a professional soldier. "They're trained to cause injury, not death. It costs the opposing force more resources to deal with an injury than it does to deal with a dead body, thankfully. That puts the strategic advantage on causing injuries rather than death. Think about it. If, in a war, you shoot one of the enemy dead, it requires a body bag and 2 people to carry the body away after the battle, assuming that your forces are still operational in that region. With a dead body, there's no pressing urgency to stop what they're doing and to try to save their own. That person is gone," Dr. Briggs continued.
If, on the other hand, you injure one of the enemy, depending upon the severity of that injury, it takes one or more to immediately deal with the injury in order to save that soldier's life. It takes ambulatory transport to relocate the injured to a field hospital, and ambulatory transport is resource intensive. Now you're up around 5 or 6 people to deal with that one injured person. When they get to the field hospital, it takes doctors and nurses to treat the injury, in which case we tack on another 3 or 4 people. We're up to nearly 10 people, a helicopter or field ambulatory transport, an equipped field hospital, all to deal with one injury. Dr. Briggs tried to drive his point home. The logic is very cold in terms of its lack of humanity, but it actually protects life, and that's perfectly understandable. With the dead body, the only resources it takes are 2 people, a body bag, and bulk transport. The resources required to deal with the injured scales logarithmically, whereas the resources to deal with the dead scales linearly at a ratio of about 4 people to deal with 50 bodies, a ratio of about 12.5 casualties to 1 person to deal with them. With an injury, that ratio is much more compact and, as I said, scales logarithmically, meaning that it takes many more resources to deal with an injury versus a death. Zhang, having quickly worked out the math in her head, added to Dr. Briggs' answer. So that cold logic actually saves lives, because it is part of the training doctrine, Dr. Briggs explained. But in the heat of battle, how many of those soldiers are actually observing their training? Alicia asked.
Most of them, because training is about enforcing an action or response so that it is second nature, rather than part of the front line of a soldier's awareness. When you decide you're going to pick up the cup and take a drink, you're not consciously thinking about every muscle involved in completing that simple task. You do it without thinking about the details because your brain has trained your limbic and motor control system how to do it already, by repetition, enough so that it becomes second nature. Bryce jumped into the conversation. True. Also, you'd have to assume that when you go to pick up a cup, you aren't overwhelmed by the risk of spilling it. If it was a hot drink rather than a cold one, that risk might be a factor in your success of actually picking up the cup, depending upon whether you're focused on the action or the risk posed by the worst outcome, Alicia pondered out loud. Clever metaphor. If a soldier during a battle is constantly focusing on the worst possibility during battle, they aren't likely to operate as effectively. Like being focused on spilling the hot drink rather than being focused on getting it to one's lips, Zhang thought out loud. Isn't all of this a little dehumanizing? Monique asked. Perhaps, but that's an enduring question that has a long history. Is it human nature to, to fight war or to fight peace? Katya asked rhetorically. I'm sorry, but I couldn't help but overhearing your conversation. Certainly very interesting. May I interject? One of the passengers interrupted their conversation. Certainly. How can we help? Zhang put her hand on Dr. Briggs's. We're both veterans, my peer beside me and I. I'm Master Sergeant William Harwood of the United States Marine Corps, and my friend here is Master Warrant Officer Brendan Lewis of the Canadian Armed Forces. As I stated, we couldn't help but overhearing your conversation, and I thought that it might be best alleviated of misinformation by the opinion of 2 veterans, both whom have been under live fire during armed conflicts numerous times. MSG Harwood introduced MWO Lewis and himself. Sure, we'd love to hear you, Monique smiled at them. First of all, the vast majority of what you've stated is true. It's the application of theory and strategy that you're talking about. The kind of thing that command might discuss that deals with the whole rather than individual parts. And that's the way of things. In the military, in big companies, any organization that operates under the pressure of mission-critical objectives. Now, having led men into battle, both MWO Lewis and I, we can tell you that at the tactical level, attitudes and opinions tend to be a little more practical and often somewhat more earthy, you might say. MSG Harwood explained to the delegation. Exactly. Under the heat of live fire, a soldier often becomes mission-focused, cohesive, especially if the team has had time to gel, bond, become familiar with the other individual parts. Everything happens fast, and it's like the entire world,
Everything you know shrinks down to wherever you are. You're so focused. Almost like you're both a squad and a bunch of individual soldiers at the same time. You're aware of each other, and you're aware of the direction of the threat depending upon the circumstances, MWO Lewis added to his peer's point. When that first report is heard, the unmistakable report of a rifle, a burst from anti-personnel weaponry, a blast from a mortar shell or artillery emplacement, everything changes. The soldiers become a cohesive unit, if training and leadership have done their job well. Everything instantly becomes about objectives. If you're part of an assault, you started with an objective, and the majority of soldiers are all in the know and have a role in that objective. If you are defending against an assault, depending upon your situational awareness, your objectives present themselves, usually on a priority basis. An LMG has higher priority than small arms fire, so your objective is the opposing force's LMG emplacement. An armored vehicle, especially one with anti-personnel armaments, has a higher priority than, say, an LMG squad based upon their threat capacity. And all of this is going through your head in real time when you're under fire. You and most of the men under your command aren't focused, as you said, on the worst outcome. They're focused on the completion of the objective. If you're leading your squad, then you're picking the objectives based upon the call of your CO, and more often than not, you're taking initiative in that role following chain of command, and based upon the threat. But we don't stop and think about it. We just do it. As you said, it's first nature to us. MSG Harwood's stern voice spoke without any discernible wavering in perspective.
To add to MSG Harwood's point, and to address your earlier statement about whether you shoot to kill or shoot to injure, when you're under fire, you're not thinking about the possibility that you're gonna die. You're actually liberated from that frame of mind and super focused on what you're doing. When you look down the sights of your rifle and you have a man in your sights and your finger on the trigger, you're taking everything into consideration, including that person's life. Even when the incoming gunfire is cutting through the air and flying by your ears with a head's breadth to spare, you're taking on your objective. When you aim and pull that trigger, you might watch the path of your round in relation to your sights if you've loaded tracers into your clip, and then adjust your aim so that you have a chance to hit that target. At that moment, when you know you have a bead on your target, that's when you make the choice. I have the odds in my favor that I'm gonna hit my target. Am I going for the kill? Or am I going for the injury? Time slows down at that moment before you first pull the trigger, and I'd bet that most soldiers would say that they went for the injury rather than the kill when firing a rifle. When you're firing larger munitions, you don't have that luxury. When you know that about yourself, you truly know your enemy. When you're aiming at them, you can be rest assured that on the other side of that battlefield, there's someone aiming at you. And the same thing is going through their mind. On either side, we're playing with the same risks. We do our best to protect life where we can, but we don't focus on the things over which we have no control. Most of all, the objective comes first. It's how you get there that defines your humanity, and what kind of retaliation you can expect from the opposing force. MWO Lewis complimented MSG Harwood's explanation from the perspective of members of the armed forces.
So, I would say that you're on the money when it comes to what you explained and why military doctrine is that way. But in the end, it all comes down to the one behind the sights and that one moment that takes less than half a second. In that moment, you're both yourself and the enemy. What you're dishing out is what's coming at you. I'll bet you it was the same deal in the Vietnam era, but those boys were dealing with a very different situation, and all coming from a very different environment than that of the opposing force, the NVA. You can complete objectives and win all the battles you want, but you cannot overcome the will of the people, and that was the mistake of that war, MSG Harwood added. I'm glad he spoke up, MSG Harwood, MWO Lewis responded. I'd say we all are. It might sound pompous of us bourgeois to be discussing such a sensitive topic, but these are things that need to be discussed. How might we both shed ignorance and understand one another otherwise? Asked Talon, who spoke up having been listening in on the conversation from the beginning of Dr. Briggs' airplane-bound lecture. I may not agree with some of your opinions,
pompous or not, but I certainly agree to disagree. And as a great philosopher once said, I'd fight to the death for your right to have them, MSG Harwood asserted in response to Halen. Canada was a pretty vocal part of the peace movement, especially in the era of modern rifles, Alicia jumped in, clearly out of her age category and league. And cannabis, not to mention LSD, promoted by a big backer of modern physics and the Copenhagen Principle by the one and only Timothy Leary, Bryce added honestly. Oh, give me a break, Bryce. This isn't about Timothy Leary, but the fact that so many of the youth of that generation had chosen to follow the idea that they could affect the politics of their governing bodies simply by the consumption of substances that, in all honesty, were self-interested pursuits of ecstasy, Dr. Briggs responded, and the lines were drawn.
I honestly can't comment on that statement, Dr. Briggs, but I'd have to agree that a great many people found solace in the communion of their appreciation of cannabis, and yes, LSD, during the era of peace, love, and hippie beads. Whether you agree or not, that is a factual part of history. We're not talking about the damages and morality of substance abuse here. There's evidence of that everywhere nowadays, and it is a very big problem. Though, in parts of Canada, they've solved much of that crisis by decriminalizing cannabis and focusing resources on the opioid crisis. We're talking about the fact that during that time, in the 1960s and 1970s, that the attraction of young Americans dodging the draft and fleeing to Canada arose from the risk of returning only 3 months later in a body bag. The statistics supported that fate for most who were drafted. That's a remembrance of history coming from someone who completely supports the existence of the military and LGBTQ2 rights. My wife and I have attended every Canadian military air show and every Pride parade for the last 20 years and enjoyed them both thoroughly, Bryce responded. Fleeing to Canada didn't stop war or its weapons, though, Dr. Briggs countered. Weapons merely exist because of the plow, it being the foundation of modern civilization. The plow led directly to the development of the military. Why? Because there are people who'd rather take resources from others rather than developing methods of producing those resources themselves. If you invent an efficient way to harvest and produce resources, then you'd also better develop a method to defend them and yourselves, Bryce responded firmly. My dear Bryce, you seem to have forgotten that isn't the only reason that weapons exist. Weapons also exist for when one group of people try to force another group of people what to believe and how to live by the rules of that belief. That's another very pertinent reason that weapons exist, Dr. Briggs began. Sounds like we're on the same page, Zhang responded. Exactly, Zhang. You're admirably brilliant, Dr. Briggs flirted. And you're easily impressed. Wait until you see me when I'm really impressive, she flirted back. I can't wait, Dr. Briggs responded, and they both blushed. So, as I was saying so flagrantly, having not lived during that era, nor having experienced what those poor high school and college draftees and dropouts had experienced, not to mention the poor citizens, mostly farmers living in Vietnam at the time, the fact remains that warfare had changed significantly since World War II. Yet, everyone who jumped in were operating under the premise that it was the same thing, the same kind of war. An oppressor, albeit in the form of communism through a former ally of the West, versus the oppressed, liberty-seeking, consumer market-ready capitalists liberating themselves from socialism. The kind of thing over which Americans love to fight, and love to jump into a fight. The kind of thing that is great for the utilization of the press as well, though that backfired as a result of the massive anti-war activism. Something that the Vietnamese didn't have, but that the Americans did, and in great abundance, Dr. Briggs continued. The American public was not even nearly in agreement over their military presence in Southeast Asia, Bryce added. Exactly, Dr. Briggs pointed at Bryce as if awarding him with a medal. My parents were a part of that generation in the USSR, Victor responded uncomfortably, as were mine. In fact, how you say, a cousin of mine fought in the Vietnamese War on the side of the North Vietnamese. He was a ground intelligence officer, Katya added. It seems that we have some hunters and collectors with us, Bryce acknowledged. Or the family thereof, and certainly a great reason why they're with us, Raleigh reminded the academics. If we were hunters and collectors operating in a civilian capacity, do you think we just outed ourselves by revealing the ancestry of one of our own? Victor responded. Duly noted, Victor. I was only joking with you. Besides, we're all under orders in the delegation for a full debriefing in Canada by diplomatic officials and the local diplomatic representatives for each of the countries we're visiting on this delegation. In a sense, we're all hunters and collectors, whether we like it or not. I'm sure that the Eastern delegates are under the same orders, and that our discussions have already served both theirs and our diplomatic purposes, Bryce advised Victor and the rest of the delegation.
Hunters and collectors? What are they? Asked Monique seductively in her youth, knowing intuitively that one of the academics, especially the male ones, would likely trip over themselves to answer her. As the bait was laid, so the trap was sprung in an ever-so-friendly manner. As most women intuitively knew, ego rarely refrained from the sexual opportunity of impressiveness, especially where a male counterpart was involved. Ironically, in this instance, it was Dr. Briggs who was already pining for the affections of Zheng Naiwang, who'd sprung Monique's ego trap. She'd not intended it, but it did make him appear to be hedging his affections in multiple directions. A very good question, Monique, Dr. Briggs responded, jumping on the opportunity to continue his lecture. Monique, a woman of experience, despite her youthful appearances, indulged him by her attention paid towards him, crossing her toned legs for his appreciation. Zheng immediately noticed, and in her attraction towards Dr. Briggs, drew her finger seductively along the top of her blouse, very effectively drawing Dr. Briggs's eye against her new French competition. She played innocent until she was sure his attention was solely upon her. The term hunters and collectors actually refers to those in the intelligence community who gather ground-level intelligence, especially preceding and during armed conflict. They're generally the most common of operatives, fitting into their local surroundings and drawing little attention to themselves. If you suspect someone of being a hunter or collector, then chances are they aren't at all, for they're undetectable, Dr. Briggs explained academically to Monique. She blushed seductively, as if on cue, towards Dr. Briggs. Zheng immediately caught Monique's lure, secretly smirking at her, and then leaned back in her chair, exposing the slit in her dress ever so slightly to expose her pantyhose legs for Dr. Briggs, who immediately took notice. I'm finding it slightly hot in here. Dr. Briggs loosened his tie, though the others, with the exception of Monique and Zheng, had no idea about what he was talking. Monique winced in defeat as Dr. Briggs's eyes wandered Zheng's body. Zheng reveled in her victory, however, ever so modestly. So, getting back to the academic aspect of your great lecture, Dr. Briggs, Bryce stepped in. Katya suddenly tapped Victor's leg, nudging him to life and in support of Bryce.
I completely agree. Your lecture is astounding, he improvised for Dr. Briggs's ego without the need for much acting. We're either on the brink of genius or the brink of the overindulgence of the onboard bar, Valerie responded as the stewardess nodded ever so inconspicuously in acknowledgement. May I collect your unused cups, please? The stewardess politely asked. My good mistress, perhaps you could tell us where we are, asked Bryce of the stewardess. Gwange, Zheng responded. Yes, you're right. We're just over the northern tip of the border of Vietnam, the stewardess responded to both Zheng and Bryce. You are a complete genius, my dear. Mid-spaces and borders are what this whole issue is about. Bryce winked at the stewardess, who unabashedly continued on her way. You never cease to amaze us, Zheng, Bryce added, looking to Zheng. Meanwhile, Dr. Briggs withdrew himself for a moment in disbelief that Zheng had calculated their location, not knowing that this intelligent mathematician and computational biologist had simply used her knowledge and experience of the region to calculate it in her head.
Exactly, Dr. Briggs responded. Monique rolled her eyes incredulously, ceding to Zhang. Never underestimate an academic, Zhang mouthed to Monique. Helene, who'd been monitoring the whole situation, put her hand down on Monique's shoulder. Ego has no place in this. Not here, Helene reminded Monique. I'm sorry, boss. Monique's competitive nature ceded to Zhang. This isn't about winning or losing, Monique. It's about commitment. He's just a stop on your way to your destination. But to Zhang, he is the destination that she's been looking for her whole life. He really is attracted to her. He just hasn't realized it yet. Step aside for the purpose of love and let the head meet the tail so that the circle can be completed, suggested Helene to Monique. I have no idea what you two are speaking of, but I'd wager that Dr. Briggs and Zhang are a couple in the making, Katya interjected quietly to Helene. We couldn't agree with you more, and I love to see my friends get together, Monique responded quietly to Katya. We're friends, right? Monique asked Zhang and Dr. Briggs.
We sure are, Monique. I wouldn't have you any other way, Zhang replied. Always will be, friend, Dr. Briggs agreed. Victor spoke. Now can you hear the rest of your lecture? Victor requested. Please continue for us. Zhang spoke in a simultaneously academic and seductive fashion to Dr. Briggs. We're talking about the middle strategic ground here, the halfway point between northerner and southerner Vietnamese attitudes, Dr. Briggs explained. Wait a second. How can you explain an entire people according... Bryce began, perhaps playing the devil's advocate. According to geography and their proximity to one another in relation to a compass? Seems to work pretty good for Korea, both north and south, Dr. Briggs continued. Technically, they're two different countries, Alicia reminded Dr. Briggs. They weren't always. At one time, they were all the same people, Victor returned. That and their differences had to begin somewhere, namely 2 or more Cold War powers catering the benefits of their global brand to the local population, who, according to their geographic proximity, chose to favor one more than the other, Dr. Briggs lectured them. There's a lot of history in both those regions that lends itself to determining which side of that brand those populations ended up on, namely the Indochina Wars that preceded that conflict and the Korean War, in which Canada took part, supporting South Korea and its then NATO allies, Bryce countered.
Yes, the French certainly didn't want to lose their investment in the region, but most of that can be explained by proximity to both Russia and China, the influences and backers of the North, i.e. communist, in each of those conflicts. Not only that, but in every such conflict involving the West, imperialism is often grouped with communism, or by itself in the absence of communism or socialism. That's written in the history of the Americas, from the initial exploitation of the Americas onward, including the attempted annexing of South America by European powers, in which case such attempts at annexation were driven purely by the natural resources of the local population, or cultivating the trade resources of their empire for exploitation on the emerging world trade market. The same attempts were made when Europe arrived with their navies, and religion, at Southeast Asia's doorstep. However, we'll just stick to the 2 pertinent conflicts, which are very much related to our trip here to Vietnam and South Korea, because those conflicts and their resolution were at the heart of one of the most interesting and unique aspects of Vietnam, how 2 groups of people that embrace very different concepts of how their society should be run are able to coexist peacefully in the aftermath and many generations thereafter such a war, Dr. Briggs described for them. It's unfortunate that we're only limited to visiting one side of that story here in Vietnam, Alicia remarked. How so? Asked Monique from her window seat beside Helen. We're only scheduled to visit one city here, and it's going to be Ho Chi Minh, Valerie answered as she tabbed through an itinerary on her tablet. Well, at least we'll get taste of one side of the story, Katya responded optimistically. At that moment, there was a loud thunderclap just outside of the aircraft, preceded by a sudden bright flash. Helen turned immediately to check Monique's window, half suspecting that Monique had, in the role of her alter ego, the Eclipse, been the source of the sudden excitement. Monique still sat beside Helen, peering out the same window at the engine nearest them. bright bursts of plasma shot out from the exhaust, which had begun trailing a dark plume of smoke as Helen's eyes fell upon it. Despite the horrific scene, this is not what immediately startled Helen amidst the unfolding calamity.
There, entwined around the length of the wing, was the serpentine eastern dragon known as Weltherwisp. As visible as day, its clawed tendrils reaching into the engine, yanking bits of the ramjet blades from the spinning turbofan and tossing them carelessly into the oncoming airstream. The airliner suddenly banked to the side of the damaged engine, rolling nearly 30 degrees before the pilots and aircrew managed to stabilize and level it. A large fire now engulfed the entirety of the engine as Helen spied Weltherwisp, a large grin across his serpentine face. It looked to the engine, struggling to reach within, its clawed hands grabbing at the last bits of the turbofan assembly. A smirk crossed the dragon's face as it failed to reach its intended target. That expression quickly changed to one of elation as it looked back to Helen, having found the piece it was attempting to yank from the aircraft. Helen looked back in shock as Weltherwisp winked at her, as if inviting her to join in the dragon's fun. She smirked back at Weltherwisp intensely as Monique looked to Helen, seeing her expression. "Don't ask," Helen said firmly to Monique, then leaning back in her seat. She closed her eyes and concentrated, drawing in several breaths in energetic chi, focusing her energy body. Her energy body congealed within her solar plexus, traversing upwards to emerge from her heart, where, like an ethereal body, it climbed out and onto the airframe of the airliner. It then traveled along the surface of the hull, outwards along the fuselage, and out onto the wing. A moment later, she materialized, standing on the wing of the craft in her full butterfly dragon costume, balancing on the flaps of the airliner. "Well, it seems that in your dreams, you heard the screams of this engine's last steam," the dragon spoke, its voice sounding like thunder. The butterfly versus the dragon. Weltherwisp entwined tightly around the wing, its head moving close to her face and coming eye to eye as if to challenge her. "What has gotten into you?" She pushed the dragon back, and it retreated away from her as she grabbed hold of its enormous clawed hand and tried to pull it free from the engine. "Look at the little butterfly who has come so far. I ride the wings of planes and follow the whims of the stars. Can you not see that you're interfering in matters beyond your place in this world?" Weltherwisp challenged her. "You invited me into this, remember? The field, the cocoon, your beginning?" Helen pushed back, her wings spreading out from her back, thrusting her forward as she attempted to unravel the dragon from the wing. Weltherwisp retreated, unwrapping itself from the wing as her momentum gave her presence. Its head dodged, attempting purposely to direct her momentum away from the wing. She followed, unaware of Weltherwisp's deceit. Her momentum carried her far away from the aircraft as the dragon resumed its dismantling of the aircraft's engine. Her wings spread wide, slowing her. She then twisted into the wind, spinning backwards and directing herself with twice the momentum back at the dragon. She collided with immense force, gingerly grabbing the dragon's arm and carefully withdrawing it from the aircraft's engine. "I'm very impressed, and you're obviously obsessed. But I do digress that you cannot know the rest." Weltherwisp's wings spread, dwarfing hers and thrusting them both back to the wing. Weltherwisp's fingered hands grasped her waist and held her fast against the fuselage of the airliner. It then used its rear claws to hold her in place as it crawled the length of the wing with its front tendrils. She struggled against the weight of the enormous dragon, suddenly realizing that it had an obvious weakness it had overlooked. As its front right hand grabbed onto the damaged engine, Helen's wings wrapped around her arms, strengthening them as she hefted directly against the dragon's tiniest claw. She pushed with all of her force and effort until the dragon's toenail became dislodged. "Arg!" Weltherwisp both simultaneously screamed and cursed in no less than 36 languages and 153 dialects. The enormous dragon grasped at its baby toe, looking to Helen in shock. "How could you? Dare do you? When we were such close friends? Beginning till end?" Welterwisp became a tangled mess, grasping at its toenail in apparent pain. In the airliner, Monique and Alicia peered out to wing, seeing nothing but the damaged engine spewing flames and sparks of molten metal. Helen's body inside of the cabin remained motionless, her eyes remaining closed as her grip tightened on the armrests of her seat. The dragon unraveled from the wing, its enormous butterfly wings spreading as it jumped to the top of the fuselage to dodge Helen, still rubbing its baby toe. She spun herself, falling off of the flap as her wings shot out from her back and caught her descent, speeding her up around the other side of the fuselage, where she grappled with Welterwisp once again. "Is this what you've been doing? Where you've been hiding since our last encounter?" She struggled against the creature's enormous strength. "Nay, gone. I, Yuan Lin Ying, strong. Let's just say that this is something that you're seeing from the wrong end. Like you told your friend, sometimes the tail needs to meet the head rather than the other way around." Welterwisp responded to her in rhyme. "By bringing an airliner down and killing all of these people?" she challenged the serpent. "And yet the craft is still in the air, yet of my craft you're unaware. Butterfly." Welterwisp responded, gently knocking Helen down, sending her tumbling along the length of the fuselage, where she stopped upon colliding with the vertical stabilizer. She grabbed at the fin, just barely clasping the edge as she watched Welterwisp jump into the air and take flight. "Stay up, not down, though this is Taka for now." Welterwisp disappeared into the clouds with one flap of its enormous wings. From her vantage point, hanging onto the vertical fin at the rear of the airliner, she watched as one final explosion of the engine sent the remaining parts of the turbofan spinning towards the rear wings, just narrowly missing them. The fire had stopped, as had the smoke, and where the turbofan once sat spinning, there was only a gaping hole between the front of the engine and the rear, through which Helen could see clearly. She pulled herself, launching herself forward into the air, her wings spread. With one flap, she was able to thrust herself to the front of the aircraft and look directly in the cockpit. The pilot seemed to have everything under control, and the emergency had subsided. As the captain picked up the handset for the intercom, Helen opened her eyes, suddenly pulling her ethereal body back to her physical one like a slingshot, just in time to hear the captain speak over the intercom.
Attention, attention, this is the captain speaking. As most of you know, there has been a problem with our right inner engine, which is no longer operating according to specification. The aircraft is completely safe and will continue to remain so until we land at Hanoi International Airport for an emergency landing. Please remain seated for the next 10 minutes until we verify that there are no further safety hazards. Just for your information, this aircraft is designed safely to fly on a single engine and even to land in the event that none of the engines are operating, with 100% survivability. We apologize for any discomfort or inconvenience this has caused you. Our flight attendants will be making rounds to ensure your safety. Please cooperate with them and follow their instructions to the best of your ability. Thank you for choosing Vietnam Airlines, the captain announced as the calm returned to the passengers. "Looks like we're getting an opportunity to appreciate both sides of Dr. Briggs's story," Bryce suggested. "Sounds like a great opportunity, but for how long? I mean, we're obviously going to have to catch another local flight to Ho Chi Minh City," Zhang asked. "We have a one-day leeway before our meeting with the delegates in Ho Chi Minh City. Our rooms are booked there, and we have no arrangements yet, but we could change our itinerary if need be," Valerie confirmed with Alicia, who looked to the other delegates. "Let's wait until we know all of our options in Hanoi," Alicia responded, looking to Helen, who seemed rather off. "I'm guessing something is up that has nothing to do with the engine suddenly exploding for seemingly no reason?" Alicia asked Helen suspiciously and quietly. "Is it that obvious?" Helen replied. "Is what obvious?" Monique asked the two of them. Helen leaned forward and spoke. "I saw our friend on the wing," Helen whispered to the two of them. "Which friend?" "Oh, that friend," Monique said in sudden realization. "Except that it wasn't so friendly a visit," Helen told them. "Are you saying that Welterwisp is responsible?"
Alicia asked quizzically. Exactly. Sleeves rolled up and yanking bits of the engine out and tossing them away like nothing, Halen described for them. So the dragon tried to kill us all? Monique asked, speaking just a bit too loud. She paused, looking around the cabin as everyone stared at her.
A monster on a multiplayer mobile game. It tried to kill us, really? Monique responded quickly and somewhat blandly, holding her phone up. We nearly crashed, lady. How can you be playing games at a time like this? Someone from the back of the cabin asked her rhetorically. Another 20 passengers all held up their mobile phones upon which they'd been gaming, as if to punctuate Monique's explanation. It's a sign of the times, the same man responded, grabbing his face with his hands and shaking his head. We're still here, so obviously that wasn't part of the plan. Alicia continued with their previous conversation. Well, their wisp just answered me with the same old whimsical questions and rhymes as usual, as if it meant for us to take this path. Ironically, it said something about the tail meeting the head, Halen told them. That's what you said to me about Jang and Dr. Briggs, Monique reminded Halen. Yes, I know, but I said it as the head has to meet the tail, not the other way around, Halen recalled for Monique. Sounds like it's referring to something backwards, Monique suggested. Perhaps, but what if it's referring to time rather than people, like trying to have the future meet some part of the present? Alicia thought about it. Well, the has done that before. Remembered the future the same way that we remember the past? We could be playing out something it knows about in our future, and by dismantling the engine, it was making sure we'd end up on that path, Halen suggested to them. We should investigate this when we've landed. I'll bring Valerie up to speed. Let me know if you remember anything else, Alicia suggested as she turned to speak with Valerie. Are we through the worst yet? Victor's knuckles whitened, beads of sweat dripping down his forehead as he clung to the armrests of his seat, his eyes still closed. Katya sat beside him, rubbing his closest arm, trying to calm him down. Is your friend all right? Asked one of the flight attendants as she strolled the aisle, checking on all the passengers. Husband, thank you for asking. He should be fine. He has a serious history of vertigo. He's fine as long as he doesn't see the windows or there isn't turbulence. So, as you can imagine, he's quite startled right now. In my professional opinion, I'd say he's in mild shock.
I'm not in shock. I'm just very cold right now, Victor replied, his voice shaky and wavering with his thick Russian accent. Sir, you didn't sustain any injuries during the equipment failure, especially to the head? Asked the flight attendant, reaching up and pulling a blanket from the overhead compartment. No, not at all. No bumps or thumps. I'm just cold, Victor said, shivering as the flight attendant covered him delicately with the blanket. Please make sure he remains conscious, and if there's any change in his condition, don't hesitate to use the intercom system to summon me or one of the other flight attendants, she insisted to Katya. Thank you. I think he'll be all right. He's just big baby, Katya said in response to the flight attendant's concern. Besides, I don't know what's worse, being in shock or having to listen to the last bit of Dr. Briggs' armchair lecture, Victor continued sarcastically. I heard that, Dr. Briggs responded, holding back his laughter. Yeah, I think somebody's diaper needs changing, Zivalong added. Just in case you were thinking about using the intercom system for that, we don't change diapers. The flight attendant caught the ball for her aircrew, bringing about a round of laughter in the entire cabin. 45 minutes later, and the airliner safely came to a stop as emergency vehicles pulled up to the craft. Mobile boarding ramps were lined up with the exits, and the passengers were safely escorted from the airliner out onto the tarmac just outside of the terminal. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Noi Bai International Airport in the capital city of Hanoi. The same flight attendant directed to the passengers to the emergency entrance of the terminal. As one of the Vietnamese engineers was hoisted via crane to examine the damaged engine. Looks like there was an impact. No signs of any organic matter. The engineer spoke over his headset to the engineering department of Vietnamese Airlines. That rules out a bird. Anything else? Responded the chief engineer. No.
All the evidence points to a large hailstone, maybe. The impact caused catastrophic failure of the turbofan, the motor and its retaining ring. The fire partially melted the exhaust port. Wait a second. You're not going to believe this. There's giant claw marks here. The engineer spoke in astonishment. Say again? Asked the chief engineer in disbelief.